All right. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see all of you here this week. We are going to do one of my favorite parts of music theory today, which is what we call Roman numeral analysis. And this is how we see how the different chords that we have at our disposal work together to harmonize most pieces of music that you will find in the classical period, in the early romantic period. And the principle of it, the overall principle of it, carries through even into the 20th century. But this is, I've always enjoyed this aspect of music theory immensely. Hopefully you all will as well. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get rolling. All right. So just a little review of what we covered last week. I know, by the way, I know last session, there was a lot of information in the last session. There's going to be a lot of information today as well, but I would say it's going to be less information and more showing how what I'm going to show you actually applies to music. So not quite as much just drinking from a fire hydrant this week, hopefully. So just a little review of what we covered last week. I mentioned that the way we derive the harmonies that we use to harmonize the pieces of music that we play, that composers have written, comes from the major scale. And how all of you know what a major scale sounds like. If you've seen The Sound of Music, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You have a mnemonic device we call solfege syllables to help you remember how the scale goes. And a scale is a collection of intervals. In particular, it's a collection of seconds. The major scale has 2 major seconds, a minor second, 3 more major seconds in a row, and finally a minor second. That is our major scale. And from this major scale, we're going to build all the harmonies we're going to use. We then built triads, diatonic triads, where we add a third and a fifth on top of each note of the major scale to get 7 different triads, each of different quality. We have 3 major triads, C major, F major, and G major. We have 3 minor triads, D minor, E minor, and A minor. And we have 1 diminished triad, that would be the B diminished. Now, we label these with Roman numerals. I mentioned this last week. Capital Roman numerals if we have a major triad, lowercase Roman numerals if we have a minor triad, and a lowercase Roman numeral with a little degree sign next to it if we have a diminished triad. And the numerals themselves are simply the position in the scale that that chord falls. So C, if this is a C major scale, as it is, C is going to be Roman numeral 1. D is the second note of the scale. The chord, the triad built on it is going to be Roman numeral 2, and so on and so forth. Now, we're going to see how these work in relation to each other to create music. But before we do that, just want to mention, we're not just going to be working with triads here. I mentioned at the beginning of the second session 2 weeks ago that when we take a triad and add another third on top of it, we get what we call a 7th chord. 4-note chord with a third, a fifth, and a 7th on top of it. Now, we're not going to have a 7th chord for every single triad of this scale, but we are going to have a few 7th chords that we're going to use. Namely, those are going to be the D minor 7th chord, if we encounter one of those, we'll analyze it with a Roman numeral 2, lowercase, with a 7 next to it, a superscript 7 next to it. We'll have a G dominant 7th chord. That is the 5th scale degree, a 7th chord built on 5, so we'll use an uppercase Roman numeral 5 with a superscript 7. We have a B half diminished 7th chord. We write this using the lowercase Roman numeral 7 and then a degree sign with a slash through it, followed by a 7, showing that it's not a whole diminished 7th, but a half diminished. If you remember, a half diminished 7 has a minor 7 on the outside, but with a diminished triad. Now, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball here. We can also have a triad, a 7th chord that is not diatonic to this key, to C major. And that is the fully diminished 7th chord. We have to borrow a note. We have to borrow the A flat. We have to use an accidental. A flat, of course, does not appear in the key signature of C major, but the fully diminished 7th chord is used in the context of a major key. It's the one chord that's commonly used that's built upon one of these notes that we have to look out for. So, triads built on all 7 notes of the scale, 7th chords built, diatonic 7th chords built on scale degree 2, scale degree 5, and scale degree 7. And then we also have this fully diminished 7th chord, not diatonic, built on the scale degree 7. So, how do we put this all together? This is where we really get into how music works. On the top left side of your screen, you have exactly what we just had on the other screen. All of the triads and 7th chords that are going to appear commonly in a key, in a major key. Top right-hand corner of your screen, you see something that I showed you last week. This is called the circle of fifths. Now, we talked about the circle of fifths in the context of the order of keys that you get when you add a sharp. If you recall, our Father Charles goes down and ends battle mnemonic device. As you add sharps, those are the keys you get. So when you add the first sharp, F sharp, Father, you get the key of G. If you add Father Charles, 2 sharps, you get the key of D, and so on and so forth. Just going around the circle exactly as you would expect. The circle of fifths is also the basis for how we get the typical order that chords are going to be organized in major key music. So, start with the very beginning. We're in the key of C major. C is our tonic. It's our Roman numeral 1. So, we're going to start in C major, Roman numeral 1. Now, eventually, assuming this piece, whatever piece we're talking about, is still in the key of C major, we're going to eventually get back to the key of C major. Now, unfortunately, music that stays on the same chord the whole time generally is not particularly interesting. Minimalist music, the music of composers like Philip Glass, they stayed on the same chord for minutes and minutes on end. And I apologize to any of you out there who love minimalist music. I start to twiddle my thumbs after a couple minutes of hearing the same chord over and over again. There's one exception to this. There's an absolutely wonderful piece of music out there that stays on the same chord for about 4.5 minutes. It is the Prelude to Das Rheingold by Richard Wagner, the music that opens the Ring Cycle, which is a 14, 15-hour 4-opera epic that's based on Norse mythology, sort of based on the same the same mythology that The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is based. It's an absolutely wonderful set of operas, and the opening to the first opera, Das Rheingold, entirely on the chord of E-flat major for 4.5 minutes, is an exquisite example of this. But unless you're Wagner, unless it's that one instance, we're going to use other chords in this piece, in our music. So we start in C major. We want to end up back in C major. Check C major off our list. Now, in order to get the order that the rest of the chords are going to appear in, we're just going to go around the circle of fifths. And whatever triad or seventh chord appears at that point in the circle, that's what we're going to put in. So if we move clockwise around the circle of fifths, we get to G. And working backwards from our end goal of C major, if we look on the left where G major appears, that's going to be our 5 chord. And 5 is going to most commonly go back to 1. In all of music, 5 most commonly goes to 1. I assume all of you listening have been to the Canton Symphony or been to a symphony at some point in your life. If you have probably heard a piece of music that ends like this. Literally, all that is 1, 5, 1, C, G, C. And when you hear that, you know it's the end of the piece. You are conditioned, if you've heard enough classical music, you know it's the end. So 5 going to 1 is the most solid progression in all of music. Most common progression, 5 going to 1. Very simple. So now we've added a little bit more to our simple tonic 1 triad by adding 1 chord. Let's check G major and G dominant 7th off of our list, and let's check it off of our circle of fifths. Great. Let's work forwards on the circle of fifths, 1 more, and we'll work backwards on the flow chart that we're starting to build at the bottom. Next note on our circle of fifths is D. We started at C, we went to G, now to D. If we look on the left side of our screen, D is a minor triad or a minor 7th chord. So we'll add 2, position of D in C major, and 2 can go to 5, which then goes to 1. Sounds a little bit like this. You can also have 7th chords at both the 2 position and the 5 position. Sounds a little something like this. Either way works. 2, 5, 1 is an incredibly common progression throughout all music. If any of you are into bebop music, Charlie Parker and people like that from the jazz era, I played saxophone, as some of you know. I absolutely love bebop. Bebop is all about the 2, 5, 1 in every key. If any of you know the opera The Magic Flute, the end of the Act 1 finale, just so Mozart is sure that you know that we're coming to a big ending, he repeats over and over again. And the whole chorus is singing in unison. 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1, really hammering it home. So we started at 1, we can go to 2, to 5, and back to 1. Check D minor off of our list, check D minor off of our circle of fifths. Let's work backwards. Next step, we go to A. We started at C, we went to G, we went to D, and now we go to A. Find A on our scale. A is a minor triad in the key of C major. We're going to use lowercase Roman numeral 6 for its position, and we add it to the back of our flowchart. So we add one more chord, start from C major, go to A minor, and from A minor we can go to D minor, to G major, and back to C major. A minor, check it off of the list, check it off of the circle of fifths. One more swing back of the circle, go to E next. Let's find E on the left side of our screen. E is a minor triad in C major. It is the third scale degree. We'll use lowercase Roman numeral 3, and we'll put it in to its position. So now we have even more chords to work with. We start on C, go to E, A, D minor, G major, and back to C. Check E minor off the list. Check E minor off of our circle of fifths. Now, this is where the pattern breaks. We've had a very, very lovely pattern. We've gone around the circle of fifths to 5 stops. The next stop on the circle of fifths is B. But B is not going to precede E. B is going to be in a different place, and the main reason is instead of having a major or minor triad here, we have a diminished triad, or B diminished. A diminished triad is going to function differently in this whole scheme than a major or minor triad. Surprisingly to some of you, we're actually going to bump it all the way up to the front. Despite where its position is in the circle of fifths, it's going to be essentially alongside G major, alongside 5, all the way up at the front. I will show you on the next slide exactly why this is. It hopefully will make a little bit more sense in a second. But for now, suffice it to say, the position of 7 is going to be all the way up at the front, right before 1. Of course, we can have our diminished triad, we can have our half diminished 7th chord, or our fully diminished 7th. So instead of having a 5 chord in our progression, let's see what happens. Let's, just for fun, why don't we add a fully diminished 7th in there? So we'll start at the beginning, C, E, A, D, B fully diminished 7th, and back to C. You can also have a half diminished 7th, or just simply the triad. Of course, the diminished sound is always a crunchier sound. So it's just going to be a totally different effect when you have the diminished triad. So check B off of our list, check B off of our circle of fifths. Now, if we take one more turn on the circle of fifths, we get a note that's not diatonic to the key of C major. G flat is not in our key. G flat is a tritone away from C, the farthest away. This is the point where we stop. But if we look on the left side at our scale, we still have one chord that we haven't accounted for, and that is F major. F major is going to be also possibly in a different place from where you expected it to be. It is very close to C on the circle of fifths. It's one turn to the left, one turn counterclockwise, and it's going to occupy a spot alongside D minor in the second place back from the final tonic. On the next slide, all of this will hopefully make a little bit more sense. So this is the basic gist of where the chords are going to be placed in the grand scheme of things. This is not the only way the chords can flow from one to another, and I'm going to explain that very shortly. But first, let's clear up this whole issue of why 4 and 7 occupy a somewhat unexpected location in our harmonic flowchart. Check F off, of course. So 2 goes to 5, D minor goes to G major, goes back to C major. You can also, of course, have 2 be a minor 7th chord. This case, D minor. Now, look at the D minor 7th chord alongside the F major triad. The top 3 notes of the D minor 7th chord are the exact same as the only 3 notes in the F major triad, as you can see. So, because these have such similar notes, similar sonorities, they're able to occupy a similar role in the harmonic scheme. It's especially evident, I think, if you look at the D minor 7th chord in first inversion. Remember, that is where we have the second note of the 7th chord, the F in the bass. In that case, you have this. You almost feel more of a pull of this F major sound than you do of the root on top. Feels very, very F major. So because they have 3 notes in common, they're able to occupy a similar role harmonically. The same goes for the G dominant 7th and the B diminished triad. Look at the top 3 notes, G dominant 7th. Top 3 notes are literally a B diminished 7th chord, B, D, F. You just take away the root. Same thing. As a result of them having the exact same notes, they can occupy a similar role in the harmonic structure. Okay, any questions so far? Please don't be shy. Mike, yes, someone has a question? Mike, you're muted.
There, no one has a question at this point. But
okay,
you
great.
explained that really well, I must say.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
It makes a lot.
Really, thank you. Please stop me if at any point you have a question.
I will.
Okay. And for everybody, don't be shy. Really, don't be shy. I'm happy to answer questions. Okay. So, back to our flowchart. This is the absolute basic flowchart, which we have just established. First thing to remember, from 1, when you return to 1, you can start anywhere. You don't always have to go from 3. I put it that way for the sake of visualization. But from 1, you could jump all the way to 5 or 7. You can jump to the 4 or 2 slot. You can jump to 6. Or, as stated before, you can start all the way back at the beginning at 3. So, I'm going to get rid of these arrows just to clear up the flow chart a bit. Just remember, once you're at 1, pick anywhere to start, and you're good to go. So, we're going to clear the flow chart. We're going to get rid of the 1 at the beginning as well. Now, what are some other things we can do besides just go straight through in a linear fashion on our flow chart? One thing we can do is that the chords that occupy the same role on the flow chart, 7 and 5 and 4 and 2, 2 and 5 are really the stable, the more stable sonorities here because they're part of the circle of fifths. 2, 5, 1. That's the more stable sonority. 4 and 7 are not necessarily bad or lesser sonorities, but compared to 2 and 5, they're just slightly less grounded. So 7 can go to 5, and it's very easy for this to happen because you simply take our diminished triad and add a G below it to create 5. Likewise, 4 can go to 2, just add to the F major triad, add a D below, and you get 2. It doesn't generally happen the other way. It's not totally impossible, but generally we're going to go from the less stable ones to the more stable ones within the sonorities that occupy the same role. So what else can we do? 4 can go directly to 1 without passing through 5 or 7. This progression has a name. It's called the plagal progression. And the way I like to think of this progression is, if you've ever sung a hymn at church and you get to the end of the 6th verse, if you're an Episcopalian like myself, you sing all 6 verses or however many there are, you get to the end of the last verse and you sing a big Amen. Almost always 4 going to 1, just like that. The plagal progression, as we call it. Another fun one. 5 can go back to 6. This is called, you probably won't be surprised to know, the deceptive progression. 5, as I mentioned, we're so used to 5 going to 1. We're so used to. So if all of a sudden we're going through our progression, 1, 3, 6, 4, 5, 6. That'll get our attention. That totally frustrates our expectations. It's something composers absolutely love to do to wonderful, wonderful effect. Another thing we can do, 3 can go directly to 4. 3 can bypass 6, go directly to 4, starting from 1, 3, 4, and then we could do a plagal progression, go right back to 1. So these are really what we're dealing with. This, what you see on your screen right now, this in total is what we're going to be dealing with when we're talking about this type of music. So let's see a little bit of this in action. Couple of progressions that you probably recognize. The first one I'm going to talk about, I call the magic changes progression. If any of you have seen the musical Grease, there is a scene in the middle of the first act where one of the greasers sings a song called Those Magic Changes, and he actually sings the names of the chords as he sings the song. It goes something like this. C, 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 A minor, F, 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 G, 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 G7, like that. 1, 6, 4, 5. Another song in Grease that uses these changes is the great Beauty School Dropout, sung by the teen angel to Frenchie, who comes down in the middle of the musical out of nowhere. She has just dropped out of beauty school, and he convinces her to re-enroll in high school and finish her diploma. It goes something like this. Beauty school dropout, no graduation day for you. Beauty school dropout, miss your midterms and flunk shampoo. And it goes on and on and on like that. Another piece that probably a lot of you know, by the great Hoagie Carmichael, jazz songwriter. Heart and Soul. Any of you who play the piano have probably played it as a duet where the person sitting on the right plays the melody, but the person sitting on the left plays these exact chord changes. 1, 6, 4, 5. 1, 6, 4, 5. The magic changes. Beauty School Dropout, Heart and Soul, all of those. 1, 6, 4, 5. Another example, the infamous 4-chord pop song. I actually kind of think this is interesting because it uses a lot of the progressions that aren't just the linear path from left to right. We start out on 1, go to 5, deceptive progression to 6, and then forward to 4, but then the plagal progression directly back to 1. Have you ever heard of Journey's Don't Stop Believin'? Just a small town girl living in a lonely world. Train's Hey Soul Sister. Hey, 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 hey. Or Jason Mraz's I'm Yours, and I won't hesitate no more, no more. It cannot wait. I'm sure that all of those and hundreds, literally hundreds more famous pop songs use this progression. 1, 5, deceptive progression to 6, forward to 4, and then the plagal progression to 1. Now, I have a YouTube link here. I'm going to pause my presentation for a second. I'm going to copy and paste this link into the chat because for all of you adults out there, I highly, highly recommend you check this out. I must say, I know that there are a lot of people who are under 18 watching this evening. Parental advisory strongly recommended, but there's some foul language in it, unfortunately, but it is really amusing. There's a band from Australia keeps playing 1, 5, 6, 4 over and over again and sings all of these melodies that you will all know over it, and it is absolutely hilarious. So if you're of age, definitely check that out, or if you're interested, have your parents look at it first, and they can tell you if it's okay for you to see it. Okay, another famous chord progression, the 12-bar blues. There is an entire genre of music called blues music. And while not all of it is based on the 12-bar blues, a lot of it is, maybe more than 50%. Now, the only thing here that's a little different, if you notice the progression, we have 12 measures. If you notice the progression, all of these chord symbols have a 7 next to it. It's simply the style of music of the blues, and it helps to give the blues its sound. That 7 is always in there. So don't worry about that so much. That you're not going to see a tonic chord be a 7th in classical music. But nonetheless, the 12-bar blues follows this progression flowchart. Start out on the tonic, C. Again, don't really worry about the 7ths. Start on the tonic, go to F, which is our 4 chord, plagal progression back to 1, up to 4 again, back to 1, and then we have our 2, 5, 1, and sometimes in the last bar of the blues, you'll get a 5 again to help set up the next chorus. So you've probably heard it something like this. 4, 1, 4. Back to 1 on the plagal. Here's 2, 5, 1. The 12-bar blues. Any of you who are or were in your high school jazz band at some point, at least in a rehearsal, you probably had to take a solo over these chord changes. Maybe not in the key of C, but most likely you have played a solo, potentially even in performance, over these chord changes. Finally, one more famous progression, the Pachelbel's Canon progression. Everybody's probably been to a wedding, and if you've been to a wedding, I would venture to say that 75% chance the bride or the bridesmaids walked down the aisle to Pachelbel's Canon. This is a very, very famous progression. It's very interesting because it does some unusual things, including what I would genuinely say is breaking a rule. So we're in the key of D major, Canon in D. The chords, I'm going to play them through once, and then we'll talk about how they flow. And literally the same chords over and over again for an entire piece. So how do these chords flow? We start out D major goes to A major. 1 goes to 5. Next, 5, A major, goes to B minor, 6 in our deceptive progression. So far, so good. We sort of expect everything. The next thing that happens is breaking a rule. He goes from B minor, which is the 6th chord, backwards in the progression to F sharp minor. This is what we call a retrogression. Typically, we speak of chord progressions, chords going forward along this flow chart. In this case, we have a retrogression, the chord's actually moving backwards. From there, our 3 chord goes directly to 4, F sharp minor going to G major. G major goes in a plagal progression to D major, back to the 1. Then it goes right back to G major, back to 4. And then this time to 5. And finally back to 1. Very interesting progression, including a broken rule. Pachelbel lived a long time ago, before Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn, before a lot of the music we're talking about. So it's a bold move, shall we say, to do something like this. I'll play it one more time. 1, 5, 6, retrogression to 3, 4, 1, plagal progression, back to 4, to 5, and back to 1. Now, I have another YouTube link for all of you. There is a very, very similar video to the one about the 4-chord pop song, this time relating to Pachelbel's Canon. I'm going to put this in the chat box as well. Similarly to the last one I shared, adults will love this. If you are under 18, I will be in a lot of trouble if you don't ask your parents' permission to watch this. So please, if you want me to still be your youth symphony conductor in the future, please consider asking your parents first about this. All right, so moving right along. Our Pachelbel's Canon progression. Now, we have our basic chord progressions. Now we're going to talk about cadences. A cadence is a piece of musical rhetoric, as I say, and one of my professors at Manus called it that as well. Cadence is a piece of musical rhetoric, a short progression, usually 2, sometimes 3 chords, that's used to harmonize the end of a musical phrase. So, if you guys remember, I've used a lot of geometry allusions in this class so far. If you guys remember, I talked about how notes are like dots on a plot, and chord intervals are like the lines between 2 points, and triads are like two-dimensional shapes. So, Do you remember that? I'm going to use another geometry illusion. A square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. Likewise, a cadence is always a progression, but a progression is not always a cadence. Cadences specifically occur at the end of a phrase. Now, the way you can think about this is if you're singing, let's say we're singing a hymn, and we get to the end of a line and we take a breath. Typically the point where there's a period in the words, and we're going to take a breath before we start the next phrase. Typically, there is some kind of cadence that occurs at that point. And the four types of cadences we typically encounter in classical music are the authentic cadence, the plagal cadence, the deceptive cadence, and the half cadence. Now, you may have a good idea what the plagal and deceptive cadences do. If you are sort of thinking along the lines of what we just talked about with the progression flowchart, you're on the right track. Now, let's talk about the other two as well. Authentic cadences are by far the most common and the most important cadences in all of classical music. Authentic cadences are essentially any time we go from either 5 or 5/7 or 7 diminished, 7 fully diminished 7th, or 7 half diminished 7th to 1. So basically we're talking about the last step of our flow chart going back to 1. And as you can see, I wrote at the top, we have two versions we're going to talk about. Our 2-chord version, 5 or 5/7 going to 1 in root position or first inversion. So we're going to have like that, or in first inversion. You're not really going to see a cadence end on a second inversion root position chord. It's a weaker sound. It's much less stable than this or this. So you know when it's a cadence when you have a 5 chord or a 5/7 chord going to a 1 in root position or first inversion, or one of the diminished chords, triad, fully diminished, or half diminished 7th chord, going to the same thing. The 3-chord version, in this instance, 1 in second inversion starts this cadence. The 3-chord version is what I've pictured here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We start with 1 in second inversion, with G in the bass, with the 5th in the bass. We then go to a 5 or 5/7 chord while keeping G in the bass, because G, of course, is the root of our 5 chord. And then we finally go to 1 in root position. The key here is that 1 in first inversion, 1 in second inversion, the bass note stays the same between this chord and the 5 chord. And the weird thing to remember about this, as I wrote in red, a 2 chord can directly precede a 1 chord, even though that's not what the flow chart shows. It's one instance where a 2 chord can go directly to a 1 chord if the 1 chord is in second inversion, and it is immediately followed by a 5 chord. So it sounds like this. Our 1 chord, our 2 chord, 1 in second inversion, 5, with the bass staying the same, and 1. So that's a key aspect of this to remember. Okay, Next type of cadence. Next type is the plagal cadence. And as I mentioned, the big amen at the end of a hymn is a great example of a plagal cadence. This is when, at the end of a phrase, 4 goes to 1 in what we called our plagal progression. This time it is simply the plagal cadence at the end of a phrase. You already know what it sounds like. Out of context, it sounds exactly like the plagal progression. Same thing is going to be true with the deceptive progression. 5 going to 6. Same thing there. Just like a deceptive progression, except it happens at the end of a phrase. Finally, we have the half cadence. The half cadence is essentially when the end of the phrase falls on a 5 chord. When typically we're expecting the end of a phrase to get to 1. If we get to 5, we think we'll probably get to 1. But in this case, we're going along. And then we just stop on 5 at the end of the phrase. Like that. Take a breath. That sounds like the end of a phrase. It can come from 2. It can come from 4. It could come from 1, and it could also even come from 1 in second inversion. It could look like it's going to be a 3-chord authentic cadence, but instead it could just go, and then we take a breath. That is the example of a half cadence. Okay, cadences. Any questions?
No questions, Matthew.
Great. Okay, please interrupt me if at any point you need to. Now, we don't have a ton of time left, but I'm going to at least start this, and we'll see how far we get. We are going to analyze using the tools that we have just learned. We're going to analyze together a well-known tune that hopefully all of you know, using our Roman numerals and also keeping in mind the cadences we may encounter. And it's very out of season, but a tune that I figured everybody would know is A Christmas Carol. So I picked a simple Christmas carol, Joy to the World, something everybody will know, and something that I think, given what we've talked about so far, we can now analyze together using what we've learned. So I'm going to play it through once, even though you probably already know how it sounds. I'll play it through once all the way through, and then we'll go line by line and see what we can learn. There you go. Now, let's look at each line and see what we can learn from the music. So, look at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. We're now working in a different key. We're in the key of D major. It's the 3rd stop along the circle of fifths. C, G, D. As such, it has 2 sharps. C has 0, G has 1, D has 2. The sharps are going to be F and C for Father Charles. And our chords are going to be as follows. We have our D major triad on 1. We have our E minor on 2. F sharp minor on 3. G major on 4. A major on 5. B B minor on 6, and C sharp diminished on 7. As a reminder, I also put in the bottom right-hand corner our chord progression flowchart, just so we can keep track of it. So I experimented with this today. This is a very imperfect situation, but I'm going to use it anyway because I think it's somewhat effective at least. We're going to go through these, and I'm going to write in the Roman numerals as they occur. So we're in the key of D major, and we start on a D major chord. Notice there's no A in this chord. You don't always need all of the notes of the chord to define the chord. If you at least have the root and the third, you can sort of get the general idea. So we start, as expected, on the tonic. So we're going to analyze that as Roman numeral 1. Put a big 1 there. Now, that's our first note, joy. The second note here, something else to remember. Not every single note, not every single sound of a piece of music has to be a chord. In some cases, the melody is just doing its own thing in a way that's not directly related to the harmony. The opening of Joy to the World is simply a descending D major scale. Basically like do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. That's the melody. So not everything has to be a harmony. And in this case, this C sharp here, this is not in and of itself a specific harmony. So I'm going to put a parentheses around this. This is what we call a passing tone. I'm going to put a little P next to it in parentheses to remind myself, don't have to worry about that for the sake of the harmony. It's simply a melodic effect, a passing tone. So we start here, we have our passing tone, and then our next chord is a G chord. G chord in second inversion, G, B, B. And in the key of D major, our G chord is our 4 chord. So we'll write a Roman numeral 4 underneath our G chord. So we've gone here from the beginning, passing tone to G, and then we're going to go back to D in our plagal progression from 4 to 1. So we have another D chord. We're going to put another Roman numeral 1 underneath it. So far we've gone 1, passing tone, 4, 1. So we're back at 1. We can go absolutely anywhere we would like. And from here, we go to this chord. This is an E minor triad, E, G, B. It's in first inversion. We have a G in the bass. This, in the key of D minor, is our 2 chord. So we'll put a 2, a lowercase Roman numeral 2 underneath. 2 can go typically to 7 or 5, but in a special case, when it goes to a cadence, it can also go to 1 in first inversion. And that is exactly what happens here. 2 goes to 1. D, F sharp, A. We're back at 1, but it's in second inversion. And as expected, the bass stays the same, and the chord changes from 1 to 5. And even for good measure, there's a 7th thrown in there as an 8th note. So we have our 5, 7, and as we expect, it goes back to 1. So what do we have here at the end of this phrase. Whoa, let's try that again. 5, 7, back to 1. And in this case, this segment of the music right here is our authentic cadence. My real handwriting is much better than this, I promise.
So, Matthew,
so we have our, yes.
We have a question about, could you ask how do you determine whether or not something is a passing tone and it's just not another chord progression?
Right. So this is a nuanced thing. Basically, look at the notes that you have. First thing you want to do, if you can call it a chord, call it a chord. If you look at the notes and it's like, you know, this just doesn't make any sense as a chord. Like, there's a C sharp in there, but there's still a D in the bass. So the bass is here, the melody is here. That's a major 7th. We don't have any chords in the harmony that we use that involve a major 7th. So if you can't analyze it as a chord, so for instance, the next note after that, the G chord, that's a chord. This is simply a way to smooth the transition from the D chord to the G. It's nicer to sing joy to the world than it would be to sing joy to the world or joy to the world. It's much nicer to just make it a smooth line. Joy to the world. So if you can't analyze it as a chord, think about what else it could possibly be. And oftentimes, if it's moving in the same direction between two notes that sort of bridges the gap between two harmonies that do make sense, in this case, the 1 going to the 4, if it can bridge a gap between the harmonies, then you can call it a passing tone. I hope that helps. All right. We are out of time for today.
We are.
So that's all right, though. This sort of gives a good start. What I would encourage everybody to do, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen at this point.